express, mongoose, path, and body parser. The most important thing about understanding modularization is, oh yeah, I said it right. Just don't think, you know?
Yeah.
About modularization is require and export. Right? We've used it before, whether you've realized it or not. We've imported things into our files and stored them in variables, and we can use those variables to call on functions that belong to those modules, right? And essentially, we're doing the exact same thing, but we're just creating it ourselves. So, if we open this up, let's just modularize this one. RESTful Task API assignment.
Okay.
Yeah? Okay, so it's about 100 lines of code here, and we will bring it down quite a bit. Let me just, you guys familiar with require and exports? Module.exports?
Use them? Yeah, what do you mean by familiar?
Okay, let's just do a really quick overview. So here I have two files, the test and execute. So actually I meant that to be the same thing. So anyways, if we had a, what do you call it? Something that we wanted to test.
And just export the function return value.
Okay. Okay, so we're gonna export a, let's just imitate an array class. Okay, so we're gonna module.exports, and this is whatever is being required in the other file. It's gonna, the variable that we're storing it in is gonna be evaluated to whatever this is going to equal, which is gonna be an object. Okay, we'll break that down a little more. But if we had, this is just a plain object that we've used before, key value pair. Let's say we had a key called push, right? And this was a function that takes in a value, and no, that doesn't quite work. Function called add. This takes in 2 parameters, and this just returns to us a plus b. Okay, now if we go into test, we can require this. Let's go execute equals require, go to the file path, and execute, right? So now if we call on execute and hit dot, we see that there's the function add available to us. Okay, so if we do add and give it 2 parameters, let's just console log this. So we're gonna run our test file. Okay, we can see there's 11. Okay, and if we ever wanted to create another file that we're going to export a bunch of functions, okay, we would just add to this big object of functions, like subtract will be another function, takes in 2 parameters, and we can return the difference, a minus b, right? And then here we can console log instead of add, we'll just do subtract. Then we have our -1. And that's essentially it. Okay, if you want to get deeper into the module exports and the require, these are Node API modules that comes with Node, right? It's the same thing like FS, file system, operating system, read file, those type of the functions from the Node API built in C++. So you can get deeper into the understanding about it, but essentially that's what it is. Okay. So that's what we're going to do with this file. Okay, we're going to export, we're going to take out all of this code and put it in another file and export it from that file, and then replace this big block of code with the require. Okay, so Express doesn't have any specific rules as to how you do it, so you can literally do it however you want. I'm gonna do it the same way that's in the platform. That way you guys have something to refer back to as far as what we did. If you want to change it up as you get more familiar and comfortable with it, you can change it up however you like.
And this will work with Angular stuff too?
Well, this is separate from Angular. It has nothing to do with Angular.
Okay, so it shouldn't affect anything.
Okay. The response is going to be the same. Modularizing your server should have no effect on how your application runs. It should run the exact same. Okay, so let's start off with building our server directory. And inside of our server directory, it's going to have all of our different modularized folders that follow the MVC convention. Okay, so inside of our server, they have a config file and I think a models file and controller. So you can imagine our models is going to have our models is going to hold this block of code. Our controllers is going to hold all of our logic, and the config file, I think they have the routes there. Okay, so let's start off with the routes. Okay, and then we'll go deeper and deeper. So the config file will have a routes.js folder. So from here, we can take all of our routes, okay, put it inside of this routes folder. And actually, this will all need to be exported as an object, as a function. So module.exports will equal a function that's also going to take in our app module, right? So that it can still continue to run. It's still exposed to this variable app. Okay, so we're just passing it on down the line so they can continue to work normally, right? Because if we don't pass in anything, this file doesn't have a variable called app unless it's past it that variable. Oops. Past that variable from our server.js file. Okay, so we're passing it along. We'll see this again when we pass along the request and response object as well. So now that we've done this, let's get rid of some of these. We'll just have this one. We can open Postman to test and make sure that our app is still running correctly.
You have to require it, right?
Yeah, I have to require it. Take you and all of you. That. Okay, so now we just have to require that folder that we just created. Dot go into server, then into config, then into routes. Okay, so we just got to go through the file path to where we put that all of that code, and then we have to actually pass in that variable app. So we'll pass it along at the end. This is what's called an immediately invoked function. So there's no need to actually invoke it by calling on its name, right? Because it's an anonymous function. So if we wanted to immediately invoke it upon runtime, then we just add the parentheses at the end and it behaves as a function. That's a JavaScript thing, okay? So as we invoke this function, because that's what this is, right? It's a function, and we pass along app, it's gonna automatically be listening for all of our routes on this file. So let's run this. Oh, not you. nodemon server.js. Okay, port's running. So users all 8,000. Am I on 8,000? No, 3,000. Send. Okay, we get an error. Path is not defined. Okay, so we get this error, and all that means is that this variable path that we're trying to use, it hasn't been defined. We haven't required it. It's not required in the correct place, right? So in our server where we did require it, okay, we no longer need it in this file because we're not using it in this file. Okay, now we need it in this file. Okay. Okay, so now if we try it again, no such file directory stat user library mobile. Oh, it's tasks. Tasks all, or it's just tasks. That's why. Send. Task is not defined. Okay, so now this variable task is saying it's not defined. So again, we just need to move this variable, not move it completely, but it needs to be included here, as well as mongoose. And we can require mongoose, make sure it's above it so that it will work properly. Now this variable task is exposed, and we can still continue to use this task object. Task schema is not defined here. Oh, but it is. Okay, there we go. So it's complaining because I was passing in task schema. Now just to explain this, when we run this line, we're storing it inside of Mongoose, the model task, right? And we're calling it capital T task. And we're assigning it this task schema here. So now from any file, we can call on mongoose.model and whatever model we want and store that model inside of a variable called task. Does that make sense? So anytime we want to assign a model to Mongoose, we would run this line and create the name, which is capital T task, and assign it the task scheme or the schema that we want to model it after. Okay. Okay, so now let's test it. Send. Cool, we got all of our tasks. Great, so now we've chopped off about 75%, or sorry, about 75% of the code there. Now we want to modularize this even more, because this is only supposed to handle just our routing. And we can do that, separate these routes based on if we had a really large API. One API routes folder for the tasks, another one for just the users to handle those routes, another one for however other schemas or whatever we want, right? And so, because you can imagine all of these things combined can get really, really big. So you want to break it down a little bit more to be organized. So now we want to move this block of code into our controllers folder. Okay, so inside of our controllers, let's create a file, controllers.js. Okay, now these are functions that we're going to be calling on. Okay, so if we move it here into our controllers, what we're exporting is the same, similar to what we did just now in that previous example, where we're exporting a big object that we can call on whichever one that we want, or on the method, right? So in this case, this is get all tasks, okay, will be the name of it, and it'll be a function that's going to receive the request and response objects from the routes folder, okay, and then in this function, we're gonna paste all of this code to run this here, okay? we have to pass the request and response objects so that we can continue to respond and even get the body, the post data from the request object as we get to this point in our folders. Okay, so now we're going to replace that with up top here, we're going to need a variable that we can catch everything that's being exported from our controller. So I'll just call it process equals require. We'll go to controllers and controllers.js. So now instead of the route being called, we're going to call on the proper method that correlates with this actual route. Okay, so now we call process.getAllTask. We pass along with it the request and response objects so that it can continue to work properly as it moves to the next level. So now that we've exported all that stuff, we now no longer need these guys here. Okay, these guys now move into the controller. Wait, maybe not path. Path can stay there. For you, I can stay here. Okay, so let's test and see if it still works. Yep, still works just fine. Okay, so now this is going to handle all of our routes. Controller is going to handle all of our logic, and our server has been reduced down to now 25 lines, and we'll make it even smaller. So now we want to move all of this stuff over to the models. Okay, so we'll cut it out of there, go into our models, create our models.js, paste it there. Okay, there's a couple, anytime we do this, we need to make sure we're giving this file everything it needs, right? So now we need mongoose, and we'll require mongoose. Anything else? Let's see, what are you saying? Hasn't been registered for model task.
I think they do that in a folder config of mongoose so that it runs first.
That's another way to do it.
I remember that I said that on the platform. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah,
How they made sure.
that's like a bonus way to do it,
Yeah.
I believe. But here we need to require mongoose here, or that file at least. Nope. Server, models, and model. Okay. And if we test it, cool, still works just fine. And now we can get rid of you and all this extra stuff. And now this is our server file after all of that. Yeah, not too bad. All right, so if we wanted to add something, we would start off the same process, right? If we have a route, we would just build the route. App.get. App.get, do the route tasks, and then maybe ID. Request response. Now in here we're going to call on process because that's where our logic is, and we'll call on get one task, pass in request and response. Now the next step is for us to build this method get one task. So we'll go into our controller, we'll add this as another function called get one task, receive the request and response, and we can run the task.find by ID. We still have access to the request object, params.id, and then our callback task. the same thing. If there's an error, do something else. We also have access to our response object too, JSON, and we can return tasks. Okay, we could just test this out real quick. Grab an ID, go to /tasks/ID, run it. Oh, tasks is not defined. Line 24. Oh, task, singular. And there we go. Okay. Any questions there? Yeah.
This is kind of a specific question, but for example, if in controllers we wanted to talk to a function that was like, it's not a model, but it's like a big function, we probably would want to put it in a different folder, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Can you make it a callback for any kind of function, or does it have to be specific? Like, it can be anything, because I was having an error where I was like trying to call a function in models that it wasn't a model, it was just a big function, and it wasn't accepting it because it didn't want to treat it as a callback. It just wanted me to call it and then run it like line by line instead of asynchronous. But that might be, I can ask you about that later if it's too specific for this setting.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Sound good? Okay.
If we were to do like a socket IO, like if we normally all that code would just go on. Actually, that would just live all on the server, right? Or would
Doesn't
that
have
live
to.
on the component TS.
The socket stuff?
Yeah.
No, it would still have to come back. It has to respond to a server.
Okay. And so if we were to modularize that, like how are the sockets split? Because, well, I guess it's the same way.
It is.
Okay.
Anything that you would put in the server, any sort of socket code that you put here, just put it in another file, export it, and require it from here.
So it can actually live on its own JS file and then just
Sure.
import it through there. Oh, that's dope.
As long as it's being required by the server file that has access to all that code to that file.
Gotcha.
So would you suggest, like, because sockets kind of have routes in the fact that they have like listeners.
Mm-hmm.
So would you suggest putting it all in one extra file on your server called sockets, or would you suggest modularizing it even more?
If you can modularize it more, then I would.
But to start, just put it in one file and just require it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're still getting used to modularizing, put it all in one file and then break it down like how we just did.
Yeah.
And once you're comfortable, then start building on that. So it does take some getting used to, but just do it a couple times and you'll be good. Cool. Well, if that's all, then that's all.